Let's take a look at what we're doing this week in week 4. We're talking about ecological communities. You have your brief overview of the content, your learning objectives. So we're going to talk about population growth, and we're going to use some data to show how populations grow. We're going to calculate population growth from looking at birth and death data from the coyote population. We're going to also use the coyote population to identify what trophic level they're feeding at. We're going to use eDNA data on the coyote population to talk about how they're using their habitat. And then we're also going to look at community structure by identifying species interactions. And that will mostly be on your poster and on your discussion. Your learning materials, you've got your weekly lecture, which covers a lot of the main concepts from this area. We're covering the first section of Chapter 20 and all of Chapter 19. In the announcements, there are 4 videos. One covers this first section. The other 3 cover 19. So if you learn better by listening and watching rather than just reading, I highly recommend that you use those videos in the announcements. You also have a link here to a paper on trophic cascades in Yellowstone. Your first assignment is a report on coyote populations. So you can read the scenario here. Essentially, you're going to write a report about what's going on with the coyote population. You have a data set here that you will download. This is an Excel file. It's going to have 3 sets of data in it. You have population data, which is going to allow you to calculate the growth of the population over time. You have some eDNA data, which essentially allows them to go in and sample lakes to determine if there is coyote DNA in there that would suggest whether or not they're actually using that lake. If we sample and get a positive result from a lake, the coyotes have been using it. If we get a negative, they're not using it. And then we're also going to see data from scat samples where they collected scat and then looked at what the coyotes have been eating at 2 different times of year. First, let's go and take a look at the data. When you first open the coyote data, it'll look like this. Now, I've actually added this row. So I came in here and I just added a row in the beginning. So yours isn't going to have that 1965 there. But I wanted to add that so it will add it to my graph. And the population size it's saying here in 1965 was 35. So I'm going to put that there. So that's our starting population. And then what we're going to do is we're going to calculate all the other populations. The population size here is going to be whatever we had before. So we can come in here and I can hit equal, and then I can put in an equation. It's going to equal 35, which is what we had in 1965, plus however many births I had. So I'm going to go over and just highlight that. So I said plus, and then I came over here, and then minus how many deaths I have. That's our next data point. And then remember, in Excel, you can take this, you can grab it and drag it down, and it will calculate the rest of those for you. And then we're going to plot those. It's only plotting the first 2 now because I don't have any more data there. What we want is a graph that's going to plot time or year on the x-axis, and then the number of individuals, the population size over here on the y-axis. So remember how we put a graph in. We come over here and say insert, and we're going to insert a chart that's got scatter with smooth lines drawn. If I right click inside that graph and say select data, I can select the data I want. I can select that column and then that column. So I just highlighted my year and I highlighted population size. I can say okay. And again, I don't have data here, so it's not going to finish it. But once I add all the other data, it will fill that in. We're going to have titles on there, so remember you can either do it by adding chart element or go to quick layout. If I pick the first one, it gives me those chart titles. I just have to change them. If you're only plotting one Y variable, there's no need to label it over here because you've already labeled it on your axis. So you just highlight that and hit backspace. You're also going to put a figure caption underneath a figure. So you're going to get rid of the chart title. Again, highlight and backspace. And remember, in publications, we typically do not see the lines across the graph. So if you want to get rid of those, click on one. You'll see the little blue dots, backspace, and they go away. And of course, this will be filled in once you have your data completed. For your eDNA, what it's asking you to do is to look for patterns. So you're going to ask about how they're using this different space. And what are the patterns of the usage that I see? Where it's positive, that's where they found coyote DNA. So I encourage you to look at the positive and negatives there and which ones are being used. And I very strongly encourage you to also look at it on the map. Look at the spatial setup and see if you can see why we have the pattern that we do when you start analyzing the positives and negatives and where they're using it. So try to make sense out of that data in light of the spatial arrangement of the lakes. And then finally, you have your scat samples. This is showing what they're eating. So you're seeing essentially the percentage of different types of food in their diet in 2 different times a year, in June and in December. So you're going to use that data to draw some conclusions about the trophic level of coyotes and what they're eating. And is it changing over time? Is it the same? Make sure that you include that graph. So everything that's on this bullet point should be like a little section in your paper. So you really will have essentially 3 different sections of the population data, the eDNA, the scat sample data, and an explanation of each of those data sets. Create headings for each of those areas. You need to have the graph produced either using Google Sheets or Microsoft Excel or some other program you might use to create graphs, but it needs to be something that you create electronically. Always make sure that you look at the rubric to see how it's going to be graded. Your next assignment for the week is a discussion posting. And here what you're going to be doing is going and looking in your local environment for certain types of interactions. So it's asking you to go out and look for and document with photographs these different types of interactions. So you need to find one symbiosis. So it can be either a mutualism or a parasitism. You should identify which one it is and, of course, include a photo. You're going to look at exploitation. So that would be an example of either predation or herbivory. Explain which one it is and document with a picture. You're going to look for competition. It might be intra-specific competition. It might be inter-specific competition. Specify which and take a picture. You also want to look for an indirect interaction. An indirect interaction is 2 species aren't directly interacting with one another, but because they interact, let's say A interacts with B, and then B interacts with C, so indirectly A and C might be interacting. And then it's going to ask you to draw a web, kind of like a food web. But here what you're doing is when you're connecting the arrows, not only are you putting arrows in, but you're putting next to it a plus or a minus. So remember, we have plus interactions, plus minus interactions, minus plus 0. So we have all these different kinds of interactions, looking at how one species affects the other. And that's what you want to put on this graph. Now here you can use a digital diagram if you want. On this one, it does not have to be digital. So if you want, you can create one by hand that you can post there. For each interaction, describe what's going on. That is due by Thursday. And then by Monday at 3 a.m., you're going to respond to at least 2 other students. You want to check to see that they've correctly interpreted the type of interaction. So do you agree that it's a mutualism? Do you agree that it's a predation? And you want to compare your organisms. Also, when you're doing this, you want to look at this article from the Trophic Cascades in Yellowstone and our other readings. You want to hypothesize on the relative strengths of the interactions that are present. And when you think about these relative strengths, you're also going to think about what would happen if we removed one of the organisms. What would happen to that ecosystem? And your last assignment for the week is to work on the draft for your ecology poster. So you're going to take a look at your identified biome, your identified species. You're going to describe the niche that species occupies in that environment. You're going to look at the different biotic and abiotic factors that are important to the species, how it uses the physical resources, but also how it interacts with other organisms in its environment. So in this case, you might also want to put in some sort of interaction web for your species with the other species in that biome or with some of the other species in that biome. Your initial post is going to go up Thursday, and then by Monday, you're going to respond to drafts from 2 of your peers. You want to state whether you think their species is a generalist or a specialist. Compare their species with your species and ask the question, which one would have a larger impact on the ecosystem that it's in if it was removed? So you're comparing your biome and your species to their biome and their species and looking at relative importance of that particular species in that biome. When you do this, you want to provide some justification and cite literature to support that. Notice that it also tells you that you want to make sure that you go and look at the instructions on the ecology poster course project. So it doesn't list everything right here. So if we go over to the ecology course project and we go down to the ecology section of it, this lists all the different things that need to be on your poster. So make sure that you come back over and look at all of these, because that's going to end up being on the rubric for what you need to have in that poster. And remember, if you want to see the rubric, we can click on these 3 little dots. Remember, next week when you're going to be submitting all of your posters in your final form, you want to make sure that you come back over and look at this description very well. Take into account the feedback you've been given in your drafts, but also double check everything on here to make sure that you have it on each of those individual posters. And then you just have your weekly checklist to make sure that you've gotten everything completed. If you have any questions about the week, the assignment, please let me know.